my gentle and of course very modern apes, it's good to be back in front of the camera. You didn't notice that I was gone, but I actually haven't sat down and done any recording or any scripting for over a month. And the reason for this is because I've been trying to get a very important step in my doctoral journey done, which is my NSF grant and my project proposal. And I realized that it was time to go nose to the grindstone, and so I set aside a month, and I was like, this is when I'm gonna get it done.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You'll be pleased to know that I did do that. The NSF project summary is finished. I still have to do all the paperwork for it, and my project proposal is submitted to my committee, but then I do have to defend it verbally this upcoming Wednesday, which means nothing to you. You could be watching this at any time. Hopefully you're watching it after the project proposal has been approved. What is it like living in paradise? But a lot of stuff happened while I was gone, and that stuff can be binned with regard to this channel into two categories, and that is cool new scientific discoveries and creationist nonsense, the binary star system in which I orbit. I imagine the title and thumbnail have told you what we're here covering today, and if you've been following me on Twitter, you know that I have already said a lot about this particular topic. If you don't follow me on Twitter, well done. Twitter is a tar pit from which I cannot escape. I am eternally mired. It turns out that not doing any type of creationist busting on YouTube combined with being on Twitter makes for a really nasty cocktail. Essentially, because I had a lot of pent-up aggression and bloodlust by not allowing myself to debunk any creationism on this platform, I instead turned and blew off steam on Twitter, becoming a local menace. What I've realized from that exercise is two things. One, I'm really good at ratioing people on Twitter, like ratioing creationists. And when I say I mean we are really good at ratioing creationists on Twitter, because I'll just comment something mean or snide, and then you guys will like that post. That part has been a real delight. It's been fun to sort of rally the troops every time someone is saying something absolutely unhinged on Twitter, and then, you know, the Gutsick Gibbon crew, team science rolls in and just kind of bulldozes them over and makes them look very silly, which is fun. However, the second thing I learned is that I actually created my own circle of hell and placed myself in it, right? There is nothing more painful than having to explain basic concepts in biology to creationists who do not want to understand what you're saying with a character limit. So I'm trying to explain the hominin fossil record or the mechanisms of evolution, and I have 250 characters to do so. Meanwhile, the person I'm arguing with, who no doubt is paying for Twitter Premium or Twitter Blue or whatever the hell they're calling it these days, is unlimited in the amount of characters that they can use. But I'm nothing if not persistent. If you're here, you know that to be the case. So what I started doing was chaining together my tweet responses, you know, where you're like, tweet 1 out of 20, tweet 2 out of 20, so they could have my entire thought process on the subject. And it's like banging your head against the wall. I did this over and over and over again with various different, in my opinion, bad faith actors on the platform. And the part that's even more nefarious than what I previously mentioned, the true worst part, is that when you start responding to this type of content, Elon's evil algorithm notices and thinks to itself like, oh, you must really like this type of content, and it starts suggesting more of it to you. And I, like a true idiot, fall for it every time, and I engage in post after post after post by these creationists on Twitter who might not even be people. They might be bots for all I know. I've come a long way here on YouTube when it comes to recognizing that some people really are unreachable. Some people don't want to learn, and it really isn't the case, unfortunately, that you just have to present the evidence and reasonable people will be convinced by that. That just doesn't work with everyone, which sucks. And I've learned my lesson with regard to that here on YouTube, but evidently not on Twitter. So anyways, what we're going to do today is go over Tucker Carlson's recent mischaracterization of evolutionary theory when he appeared on Joe Rogan. And if he sees this video, no doubt he will change his mind because he's a reasonable person, right? This probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to provide it just in case. Joe Rogan runs the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the, if not the most popular podcasts like ever. His shtick is that he's like this average Joe who has on a bunch of different crazy characters ranging from like completely reasonable popular scientists to absolute whack jobs, and he just kind of talks to them, and I guess the appeal is he interviews them as your average person might, like just asking them the questions that come to mind. He is notorious, by the way, for kind of acquiescing to whatever beliefs his guest currently has, or at least being supremely sympathetic to them. Maybe that's just a good interview tactic. I don't really know. Now would also be a really good time to point out that Joe Rogan recently hosted a discussion between friend of the channel and archaeologist Flint Dibble and Ancient Apocalypse's Graham Hancock. So that's a phenomenal discussion that I would love to go over at some point. It's extremely fascinating to see these two interact. And, kudos to Rogan for making that kind of chat happen. To my understanding, Joe Rogan is like uber accepting of evolutionary theory. He's said as much in several different episodes, and he's very keen on talking about the similarities between humans and chimpanzees. So good for him, I guess, on that point. His guest, on the other hand, is conservative pundit Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson evidently does not accept evolutionary theory.
Cringe.
Now, this is not a politics channel, so we're not going to be talking about Tucker Carlson's politics. Instead, we are going to be relentlessly roasting him for not understanding that which he thinks is so blatantly wrong. And if you think that that has implications on some of his other opinions, well, you should follow me on Twitter. I first encountered this clip on Twitter as well. It was tweeted out by an account called Bible Radio, and the clip itself begins sort of en media res, right? So it's in the middle of the interview, and it starts kind of innocently. The two of them are clearly talking about something else, and Joe Rogan just mentions evolution with Tucker kind of butting in to give his opinion.
Cares about you. You're important to the people
but
around you.
If we don't think people are important, then what do we think is important? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Not necessarily that we don't think people are important, but if evolution is real, and if there is this constant,
it real?
I don't know, but it's visible. Like you can measure it in certain animals.
So I think it's pretty clear that Joe Rogan didn't want to have this conversation with Tucker Carlson. He kind of hand waves away Tucker's comment initially before doubling back and throwing out what he perceives to be a pretty good defeater. We can measure evolution happening in animal groups. And I think he kind of just hoped that that would be the end of it. But obviously we're here, so it wasn't.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true.
What's this, you fucking piece of shit? What's this? What's this?
So, like, where do you even start with something like this? So, adaptation just is evolution, definitionally speaking, right? We're going to come back to that, but I do want to make a note that that is something that you learn not in Biology 101, not in AP Biology, not in regular high school biology, but in the biology section of a middle school science textbook. But again, we'll come back to that. I want to focus first on the second thing that he said there, that we've given up on the theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin, that it's kind of not true. A lot of people don't know this, and I think it's precisely because it isn't emphasized enough in like early education. But the theory of evolution, right, the scientific theory, which is very different from how Tucker is going to use it later in this interview, like the colloquial version of theory, is like the foundation of all of biology. Biology as we know it today could not exist without Darwin's work. Literally. Darwin's The Origin of Species is one of the most important science books ever written and regularly tops lists, like taking the #1 spot of most important science books ever put to paper. And it's going toe-to-toe with Principia Mathematica. That's how important it is as a text, and the entire scientific community regularly recognizes this. Its ideas are so, again, foundational to everything we know about biology. Genetics, cell biology, anatomy, obviously ecology, like all of these categories, which are chapters in every biology textbook out there, rely on the theory of evolution. I'll explain a little bit. On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin's seminal work was the result of his voyage with the HMS Beagle as a young, budding naturalist. This voyage took him all around South America, and it led to him making several key observations that would lead to, after several years of mulling it over, the writing and publication of this text, which immediately sold out. Darwin notes in his introduction, "When on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the organic beings inhabiting South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts, as would be seen in later chapters of this volume, seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers." So what did Darwin see on his voyage that led him to come up with a book that claims to have an idea as to how all modern biodiversity came about? Over the course of his 5-year voyage, Darwin noticed several things that seemed to impact all populations of organism, regardless of what the organism was. The first observation was that populations can expand indefinitely, but that resources are themselves limited. Therefore, populations can only expand insofar as there are resources to sustain them. His second observation was that populations in nature do appear to be roughly stable, which means they are evidently kept in check by the availability of those resources. His third observation was that individual variation of organisms within populations impacts their ability to acquire resources. His fourth observation was that variation, each individual character, is in fact heritable from parent to offspring. And his final observation was that the environment is constantly changing. These observations seem so simple, and they are, but they're brilliant in their simplicity, and no one had ever taken this collection of observations that seem so intuitive to our understanding of nature now and put them to paper with a cohesive mechanism that explains them all collectively. Charles Darwin did, and he called it evolution by natural selection. Populations could theoretically expand indefinitely, but they can't because there is a limited amount of resources for each population within a species to actually exploit. So who gets to exploit those resources comes down to competition between individuals of that population. Those who get more resources are more likely to get big and, of course, reproduce. So it's really important that individuals compete really hard to get the most amount of resources as possible. And characteristics that allow these guys to better compete for resources like food and water and shelter and things of that nature are going to be beneficial. But the presence of beneficial characteristics within a population vary depending on the individual, because all populations have variation. So the presence or absence of specific characters in specific organisms within a population are going to impact their ability to get resources and thus reproduce. Those characters, be they beneficial or detrimental, are themselves heritable. So if you get a lot of resources, compete well within your population, and reproduce a lot, you're going to pass on those characteristics that were beneficial to you to your offspring. However, the environment that you live in is constantly changing, and since the environment itself dictates which characteristics are beneficial or detrimental, the pressure to change in any given direction is itself always subject to change. And that dance played out over long periods of time is how we explain all of biodiversity in the past and in the present. The environment changes due to geological processes. This impacts which traits are beneficial or detrimental in a given population. Variation within that population creates differential reproductive success, which allows selection to parse out those who are less fit for their environment in favor of those who are more fit for their environment. And thus, organisms change over time. Descent with modification. So then, put extremely simply, evolution is descent with modification within populations of organisms, and when applied backwards into time, species coalesce and indicate common descent. This is brilliant and intuitive, and it's observable, both in the lab and in the wild. That basic idea put forward by Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species persists to this day, even though it has been subsequently elaborated upon by the modern synthesis, genetics, things like that, right? We now have additional mechanisms for evolution outside of just natural selection, as I just described. We have mutation, which is what is responsible for that initial variation. We have genetic drift, the fluctuation of alleles by chance within populations, and the mechanism behind things like the founder effect or the bottleneck effect. We have gene flow, which is the phenomena that explains how alleles transfer between populations that may have recently split. We have subsets of natural selection, like sexual selection and artificial selection, which were themselves actually initially pointed out by Darwin in The Origin of Species, and sexual selection and the descent of man. So with that in mind, evolutionary theory, as proposed by Charles Darwin, even in its initial state, you can see why evolutionary theory is the backbone of all of modern biology, how it dictates what we do in agriculture and in healthcare and in budding fields within genetics. And you can see how it sets the stage for everything that we learn within biology from middle school to postgraduate degrees, whether we're looking at cell biology, botany, ecology, and more. So I hope that you can see how saying this...
In fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true.
...makes you look like the biggest dingus in the room, especially when paired with what he said immediately before.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
Adaptation describes how populations of organisms change over time in response to environmental shifts. You know, how they evolve? We all know what he really means here, right? He means that he takes issue with common descent, and he suggests that people don't really buy into common descent anymore. But much like the Stooges over at Answers in Genesis, Tucker Carlson here is simply packaging them together because evolution is such a dirty word for these types. They take descent with modification, aka evolution, and call it adaptation, and then they assign evolution to a subset of the initial theory, common descent. In reality, both descent with modification and common descent are both parts of evolutionary theory. So Tucker takes issue with a portion of evolutionary theory while broadly accepting the idea as a whole. Obviously, you would know the difference if you had ever opened like a middle school science textbook, or better yet, a basic biology textbook for high schoolers. You believe this guy wants to cut the education budget in America? That would be like a scuba diver wanting to cut the oxygen budget. It does my heart good, though, to see Joe Rogan flabbergasted by this. Like, he hears Tucker Carlson suggest this and he's like, how so?
Theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, you know, all life emerged from a single cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not.
There is, but let's let him talk for another minute.
And
there's not a fossil record of transitionary species, like species that are adapting to its environment.
There's
and they
tons
develop...
of record of adaptation, and you see it in your own life. I mean, I have a lot of dogs. I see adaptation in dogs, you know, through the...
Sure.
Litter to litter, but
like, I don't know if you guys know how rare it is for Joe Rogan to be kind of slack-jawed at a response from someone. Like, he genuinely kind of can't believe that someone like Tucker Carlson is really coming onto the show and pushing back on evolutionary theory. But let's address some key concepts here, right? So again, Tucker Carlson is misconstruing what adaptation is. Adaptation is like how organisms within a population are changing in response to their environment. It is descent with modification. It is evolution by natural selection. So Carlson is fine accepting evolution. He just doesn't know it, and that's probably because of the types of content that he's consuming, the young earth creationist or creationist generally media that is going to try to parse those out, as I said previously. The issue that he has, again, is with common descent. And to support this notion, he just kind of asserts that there's no fossil record, like for transitional species. And specifically, he wants to make it seem as absurd as possible. So he says a seamless transition from an amoeba to a human. So before we get to the fossil record stuff, I just want to tell all of you out there that if and when you're having this conversation with creationists and they say they accept microevolution or they accept adaptation but not evolution, you need to point out to them that they just do accept evolution. Like, definitionally, this is the case, and you can just whip out Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species or The Descent of Man or literally any biology textbook to show them that this is the case. The distinction is being made on the part of the creationists, not conventional biology. And that goes for the adaptation versus evolution, adaptation being a subset of evolution, and also microevolution versus macroevolution, which is another distinction that you'll hear creationists make. They accept microevolution, but not macroevolution. So let me tell you what the difference between those two things are really quick so you can also nip that one in the bud moving forward. Microevolution refers to change within a species, and macroevolution refers to speciation. So if they accept that new species can emerge, like at all, then they accept macroevolution as well as microevolution. What I am trying to say is, unless you are a proponent of the idea of species fixity, you accept evolution. The problem you have with evolutionary theory isn't evolution, it's evolution applied backwards in time. It's common descent. And that is a distinction that I do not see enough people making. And as I've gone over many times before on this channel, they will accept a lot of common descent. They just won't accept universal common descent. Please see my video on created kinds for more information on that whole subject. But I would love to ask Tucker Carlson some questions on this subject, right? Because I would wager that he probably accepts that all dogs are related. I would bet that he also accepts dogs are related to wolves. I wonder if he thinks wolves are related to foxes, or if they're related to African painted dogs, or if wolves are related to dingoes. I wonder if he would accept all dogs as related together in Canidae. Would he accept that dogs are related to bears, like that canids are related to ursids? What if you showed him the dog bears, or the bear dogs, right? The fossils that link these two groups together. Would he accept that dogs and bears, that canids and ursids are related to like hyenas or felids? Would he accept that dogs and bears are related to pinnipeds? Like that the caniforms are all related to one another and the feliforms? Like which mammal groups are related and which are not would be my question. And again, he would run into, if we had that conversation, the same problem that all creationists run into, which is, where does the line actually stop? Because the same methods that you use to show that dogs are related to wolves, be it morphologically or genetically, you use those same methods to show that larger groups are related to one another and that they create nested hierarchies. Now, on the fossil record, there is a lot to say, but I'll try and keep it brief. Sticking to the particularly sexy lineages, we have phenomenal support for all sorts of evolutionary transitions. Human evolution, beginning roughly 7 million years ago after our split with the chimpanzee common ancestor, is illustrated in staggering clarity with the hominins. We see every single unique human characteristic emerge slowly through geologic time in populations of more basal apes. Everything morphologically, from the size of the brain case to the acquisition of bipedalism, is found in stunning detail. Whales are linked to a terrestrial ancestor not just by a myriad of transitional forms, but by specific structures that act as through lines. Indohyus, for example, has the ankles that every other artiodactyl has. However, it has the inner ear of a modern whale. And these two structures, the astragalus ankle and the involucrum, are found in every single proposed fossil whale transitional from Indo-Hyas all the way to Basilosaurus. Why does a little land-dwelling animal have the inner ear of a modern whale, and why does an ancient whale have the ankles of an antelope? Goodness, we don't even have time to talk about all the feathered dinosaurs revealing that modern birds are still archosaurs. And now I've just picked 3 broad lineages out of thousands that I could choose from, so please feel free to look into this further, but I think needless to say, Tucker Carlson is not correct on this.
There's no chain in the fossil record of that at all.
That was an absolutely horrendous performance from start to finish.
How embarrassing. So you can see what happens when political pundits, who often are overconfident in the areas in which they regularly speak, attempt to speak with that same confidence in areas where they have absolutely no idea what they are talking about. I hope that this experience teaches Tucker Carlson a lesson and he bothers to open up a book or at least a Wikipedia article before he runs his mouth next time.
And that's why you don't actually hear people, you hear them make reference to evolution because the theory of adaptation is clearly, obviously true.
The theory of adaptation. Tucker, you can buy a used high school biology textbook for nothing on Amazon. Please, someone help him.
But Darwin's theory's totally that's why it's still a theory almost 200 years later.
It is actually astonishing to me that Tucker Carlson, who has been a public speaker and, comes across to a lot of people as relatively well-informed, although clearly that's due in part just to him speaking with authority and confidence, that a man like that, I assume he's a college graduate, doesn't know the difference between a scientific theory and the word theory used colloquially in the English language here in the United States, right? By his logic there, just in case some of you out there don't know, gravity is a theory, germ theory is a theory, atomic theory is a theory. So, by Carlson's sort of train of thought here, none of those can actually be taken as being robustly supported. Gravity, germ theory, and atomic theory. You have got to be kidding me. So let me make something abundantly clear here, right? In science, a theory is as supported as something can get without being mathematical in nature. So unless it is a mathematical equation, it's never going to graduate to becoming a law. So theory is it. Theory is the highest level of certainty that something can get, and usually it's like a collection of well-supported hypotheses through experimentation over decades of time, which, evolutionary theory, germ theory, atomic theory, all of these sort of meet that criteria. So scientific theories are well-supported bodies of knowledge that explain why something is happening the way that it does, right? In biology, in physics, in chemistry, etc. It is not the same thing as saying you have a theory as to who ate the last slice of cornbread, right? The better one-to-one there is hypothesis. But again, this is what happens when science education sucks, or you don't pay attention. But Joe Rogan, who is again just blown away by the sheer level of ineptitude here on display in his studio, he asks Tucker Carlson what Carlson thinks is responsible for the life that we see today. And Tucker Carlson responds predictably.
And I can't even guess. I mean, I have my own theories on it, but they're not proven.
What are your theories?
God created people, distinctly, and animals.
Love alcohol. It is a great neurotoxin. I love when it takes away my cognitive functioning. I love not remembering anything.
So as an assertion, this seems fine, right? If someone wants to say, I believe God created humans and other animals ex nihilo, 6,000 years ago or however long they want to go, depending on whether or not they're young Earth creationists or old Earth creationists, that's fine. Tucker Carlson here says, though, something very telling. He says, it's not proven. No, there's zero support for that, though. None. Zip, zilch, nada. In fact, if God created humans and other animals ex nihilo, let's take the young Earth creationist stance roughly 6,000 years ago, then he did so while simultaneously planting ubiquitous evidence across every scientific field that screams the contrary, that the Earth is very ancient and that modern biodiversity came about via evolutionary processes. Now, this is where, again, the based and epic theistic evolutionists come in, who take the perspective that God used evolution to bring about modern biodiversity over long periods of time. I want to make it clear for those of you who might be new, those guys are awesome and A-okay here on my channel. I have nothing against religion generally and exclusively fight against creationism because it's just patently unscientific. As I showed earlier, humans are in fact apes, and we are apes that evolved from more basal apes that are themselves primates, which are mammals, which are animals, which are eukaryotes, and you can carry that on through the entire line. So we know that humans are animals, so we're not created distinctly from other animals, and moreover, no animal appears to emerge ex nihilo in the fossil record. In fact, all animals coalesce until you reach a last universal common ancestor. And indeed, this is supported by genetics because all animals nest hierarchically, whether we're looking at their morphology or their genetics. And they nest genetically not just in functional regions, but non-functional regions as well. So sorry, Tucker, like there's nothing to support what you've just said. It's merely an assertion. And I want to make it clear, it's an assertion that is like on the same level as Scientology, right? It has the exact same amount of support as a Scientological claim or, you know, a Mormon claim or Jehovah's Witnesses claim or a Hindu claim, right? Like, it's just not in the realm of science. And if you want to say that you believe that in spite of what we have scientifically, then it becomes none of my business.
And I think that's like, I think what every person on Earth thought until the mid-19th century, actually.
Right, but
it's not a new idea.
They didn't have computers.
I love Joe Rogan's reaction there, right? He responds and he's like, oh yeah, right. Like, you hold the opinion of someone who existed before computers. You hold the opinion of like a medieval peasant. You hold the opinion of someone who could be described as ignorant. Now it all makes sense. I just can't get over how Tucker Carlson says this, like, as if he's very proud of it, right? Like, well, I hold the position that people always held before we knew the earth was round. Like, that's how it comes across to me. I hold the opinion that all people held before we knew that disease was caused by microorganisms that you can't see. Well, I hold the opinion that everyone held, a long-standing traditional opinion, that you don't need to wash your hands before you operate on someone. Like, it's such a severe case of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've almost never seen anything like it.
They didn't have a general understanding that we have today of the process.
Do you think we understand more now?
Yes.
Really?
You don't think that we understand more today?
We understand way less.
Now, I don't watch a lot of Joe Rogan. This is the highest frequency of kind of surprised by what his guest has said to him in like a I disagree kind of way that I've seen out of him. Like, he keeps being like, really? And you really think that? Which is, you know, kind of humorous. But here Tucker Carlson is, again, also just objectively wrong. Like, we objectively know more about the world around us today than at any other point in history, right? And part of that is just because there's billions of people on the earth and we're all working on learning more in our own given areas. So we just have access to more knowledge and more correct information that has been supported experimentally than ever before. So, like, Carlson is just objectively wrong about that. Clearly what Tucker means is like strange esoteric knowledge or like true knowledge or spirituality or something like that. But I do think it's worth pointing out that at no point in time, for instance, did we know as much about like beetles as we do right now, or at no point in time did we know as much about macaques or quantum theory or Pluto as we do right now. But then he finishes this thing off very strangely in a way that I guess is fitting.
We understand so little that we're actually sitting here allowing like a bunch of greedy, stupid, childless software engineers in Northern California to like flirt with the extinction of mankind.
There is a lot to unpack about that statement, and I do not think that I am equipped to do so, to be perfectly honest. That's how this whole little exchange ends. As you can imagine, creationists were really excited to hear that Tucker Carlson sort of thinks like them. And since he didn't elaborate on like the age of the earth, I think most of them just generally were like, haha, see, one of the big boys supports us. And, you know, I guess this is a good time for Tucker Carlson to reveal the depths of his sort of whack jobbery, given he's now been relegated to the complete fringes of, like, media society, right? If memory serves, he does his show on Twitter now, which is fitting. I'm glad he's quarantined there. I just wish I didn't have to see so much of him. I hope this has been elucidating for you out there who's watching this video. I hope maybe you've learned a little bit more as to the robust nature of evolutionary theory if you don't typically hang around my channel. And if you do hang around my channel, I hope this has cemented the basics just further for you. You probably didn't need it again if you hang out here a lot, but you know, it's always fun to learn while simultaneously poking fun at someone who doesn't know a lot and doesn't care to. Anyways, my gentle and of course very modern apes, it's good to be back. I hope to be back to sort of my regular video production and posting, although I am going back to Kenya this summer. Yes, the fieldwork video is still coming, I swear. And in the meantime, if you like what I do, please consider supporting the channel in a free way, which would be liking, commenting, and subscribing. It always helps the algorithm, and I found that asking it kind of triggers some of you to do it, so do it. And imagine that I'm holding like the Pokemon Hypno's little coin on a string here. I'm hypnotizing you to do it, or like the Hypnotoad. Just do it. And if you really like what I do, you can support me in like a financial way by joining the Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos sometimes when I'm on top of things, which, as I've said many times, is rare. It's uncommon, let's say. And in the meantime, my gentle and of course very modern apes, thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you real soon next time.